Okay, let's then look at responses to premise 2 of the indispensability argument. These responses come in realist, a-realist, and anti-realist options. So let's look first at 3.4211, realist responses to premise 2. Realist versions of anti-Platonism dispute that in true mathematical sentences, singular terms refer to and existential quantifiers range over things that could only be abstract objects. Non-Platonic realists hold that various objects normally thought to be abstract are, in fact, concrete. These may be taken to be either physical objects, such as marks on paper, or mental objects, or thoughts, either in human minds or in God's mind. 19th century philosopher of mathematics Gottlob Frege subjected the views that mathematical objects are physical objects or human thoughts to such withering criticism, however, that such views are scarcely taken seriously today. Frege's objections to formalism and psychologism, such as the intersubjectivity, necessity, and plenitude of mathematical objects, do not, however, touch divine conceptualism. With the late 20th century renaissance of Christian philosophy, divine conceptualism is once more finding articulate defenders. Alvin Plantinga, for example, locates himself in the Augustinian tradition in thinking of numbers, properties, propositions, and the rest of the Platonic host as divine ideas. Unfortunately, conceptualism is not worry-free. Conceptualism requires that in virtue of his omniscience, God be constantly entertaining actual thoughts corresponding to every proposition and every state of affairs. This may be problematic for the theist. Graham Oppy complains that it threatens to lead to the attribution to God of inappropriate thoughts, bawdy thoughts, banal thoughts, malicious thoughts, silly thoughts, and so forth. I think that the Christian theist should take this worry very seriously. If God has the full range of thoughts that we do, then he must imagine himself, as well as everybody else, to be engaged in bawdy and malicious acts. And moreover, rather than trying to put such detestable thoughts immediately out of mind as we try to do, he keeps on thinking about them. What about banal and silly thoughts? Why in the world should we think that God is constantly thinking the non-denumerable infinity of banal and silly propositions or states of affairs that we can imagine? Take the thought that for any real number R is distinct from the Taj Mahal. Why would God retain such inanities constantly in consciousness? Or consider false propositions, like for any real number R is identical to the Taj Mahal. Why would God hold such a silly thought constantly in consciousness, knowing it to be false? Now, obviously, the concern here is not that God would be incapable of keeping such a non-denumerable infinity of thoughts ever in consciousness, but rather why he would dwell on such trivialities. It is a non sequitur to infer that in virtue of his omniscience, everything God knows, he is actually thinking about. Yet another worry for conceptualism is that concrete objects like God's thoughts do not seem suitable to play the roles normally ascribed to abstract objects. Consider properties, for example. The chief rationale behind construing properties as abstract universals rather than particulars is the supposed need for an entity that can be wholly located in diverse places. The difficulty then for conceptualism is that God's thoughts as concrete objects are not universals, but particulars, and so cannot be wholly present in spatially separated objects. Perhaps in response, the conceptualist could say of divine thoughts what the Platonist says of abstract universals. Particulars stand in some sort of relation to them, in virtue of which the particulars are the way they are. An immediate problem for the conceptualist is that if properties are God's thoughts, then particulars must exemplify God's thoughts. But a concrete object does not seem to be the sort of thing that is exemplifiable, any more than it can be a universal, since concrete objects are particulars, and particulars are not exemplifiable, but rather exemplify. Accordingly, God's thoughts cannot be properties. But perhaps the conceptualist could say that divine thoughts can play the role of properties. In substituting God's thoughts for properties, Plantinga has suggested that particulars stand to God's thoughts in a relation analogous to exemplification. He appeals to Frege's notion of falling under a concept as the relation in which particulars stand to God's thoughts. Thus, all brown things fall under God's thought of brown. Things which are brown resemble each other in virtue of falling under the same concept. Intriguing as this suggestion might be, it is problematic. In the first place, concepts are not plausibly construed as concrete objects, for they are shared by multiple thinkers in a way that thoughts are not. Concepts seem to be part of the content of our thoughts. As such, they are plausibly abstract objects, if they exist at all. Moreover, as mental states, thoughts are characterized by intentionality, being about things, not by things falling under them. My thought of redness is about redness. It is not itself redness, nor do things fall under it. This problem can be generalized. God's thought of the number 2 is about 2. But then his thought is not 2, but something distinct from 2. 2 is what he is thinking about. But he is not thinking about his thought. He is thinking about 2. Therefore, his thought cannot be 2. Furthermore, substituting the notion of falling under a concept for exemplifying a property seems to get the explanatory order backwards. Things are not brown because they fall under God's concept brown in the way that things are brown because they exemplify brownness. Rather, they fall under God's concept brown because they are brown. Thus, the relation of falling under a concept cannot do the work of exemplification. If this is right, then the conceptualist who wants God's thoughts to play the role of properties still has plenty of work cut out for him if his view is to commend itself as an attractive option for theists. Or consider the suitability of divine thoughts for playing the role of mathematical sets. Plantinga suggests that sets be taken to be God's mental collectings. But if sets are really particular divine thoughts, then how do we have any access to sets? The question here is not whether I have a causal connection with sets. Rather, it is that sets, the real sets, are locked away in God's private consciousness, so that what we talk about and work with are not sets at all. When I collect into a unity all the pens on my desk, that set is not identical, it seems, with the set constituted by God's collecting activity. So we have two mental collectings, and since sets are God's mental collectings, the set I form is not identical to the set of all the pens on my desk. But if sets are determined by membership, how could they not be identical since they have the same members? While by no means knock down objections to conceptualism, these worries, as I call them, should motivate the theist to look seriously at the wide variety of non-realist alternatives to Platonism before acquiescing too readily to a realist viewpoint. Any discussion of divine conceptualism?
Let's start with a question from online from Dan Miller. If God has thoughts as we do, would that also entail that God would be having an actually infinite number of thoughts, which means an actually infinite would exist?
It seems to me that it must, because he has to have a thought corresponding to every proposition. So there would be a non-denumerable infinity of thoughts in God's mind.
For the divine conceptualist, why does God have to think about what he knows for these abstract objects to exist? Why is his unconsciously knowing such propositions not enough for them to exist?
Yes. Now, see, this is a very good question. And the reason is because you've got to substitute some concrete object for this abstract object, like a number or a set. So it's not enough just to say that God has dispositional beliefs, because those don't actually exist. There is no concrete object when it's just a dispositional belief. He needs to have what are called occurrent beliefs, actual thoughts in the contents of consciousness, if you're to have some ontological substitute for these mathematical objects. So that's why I think Graham Oppy's worries are so serious.
It would also cause some trouble about what God's currently thinking about, and how he's acting in the present. I think it might cause some concerns there. But
yes. Now, we'll get into this when we talk about divine eternity, because God would have to have tensed thoughts in order to know what's happening now.
And if he's
in the
thinking
universe.
about all of these things at the same time, he wouldn't be able to have those tensed thoughts.
I think you're absolutely right, Hunter.
All right. Another question from online. Leonard says, is the option of divine conceptualism closed to someone who thinks of God's knowledge more like simple intuition rather than being propositional?
I think it's closed to the divine conceptualist. Part of what I skipped over in the discussion of absolute creationism is the attempt to avoid the bootstrapping objection by adopting the doctrine of divine simplicity. On the doctrine of divine simplicity, God doesn't have any properties, and therefore he doesn't need to create his own properties because he doesn't have any. And you can read my critique of that effort to advert to divine simplicity. I think that is a recourse of desperation, because divine simplicity is a doctrine that is so widely rejected today. If that's going to be your solution to this problem, I think you're really backing into a corner. But for the conceptualist, as I said to Hunter, the conceptualist needs to have actual thoughts to substitute for these objects. We come now to 3.4212, realist responses. Consider now the realist response to premise 2. As mentioned, Carnap held that once we have adopted a linguistic framework involving terminology for abstract objects like numbers, internal questions like, is there a prime number greater than 100, are meaningful. For someone who is outside the framework, the question is meaningless. No contemporary philosopher would defend Carnap's verificationism, but his conventionalism does find an echo today in what is sometimes called ontological pluralism. According to pluralists, certain ontological questions, though meaningful, do not have objective answers. Mark Balaguer and Penelope Maddy, for example, would deny that the question, do mathematical objects exist, has an answer that is objectively true or false. On realism, there just is no fact of the matter whether or not mathematical objects exist. Now, at first blush, this might seem like a quick and easy solution to the challenge posed by Platonism to divine aseity. If there is no objective truth about whether or not mathematical objects exist, then the use of mathematical terminology is devoid of ontological significance. Internal questions about the existence of certain sets or numbers may be answered affirmatively, but there just is no answer to the external question of the existence of such entities. In that case, one cannot truthfully assert that there are objects which God did not create. Alas, however, there is no succor for the theist here. For given God's metaphysical necessity and essential aseity, there just is no possible world in which uncreated mathematical objects exist. Hence, there most certainly is a fact of the matter whether uncreated abstract objects exist. They do not and cannot exist. Therefore, our realism is necessarily false, as is conventionalism about existence statements concerning mathematical and other abstract objects. All right, let's move on to 3.4213, anti-realist responses. 3.42131, fictionalism. We turn now to what is perhaps the boldest option in response to premise 2, fictionalism. Fictionalists flatly deny that mathematical sentences are true, period. Statements involving quantification over or reference to abstract objects are false, or at least untrue. Abstract objects are merely useful fictions. That is to say, even though no such objects exist, it is useful to talk as though they did, hence the name fictionalism. The most evident objection to fictionalism is that some mathematical statements, like 2 + 2 = 4, are just obviously true. Indeed, they seem to be necessarily true. But Hartree Field reacts to the claim that a mathematical assertion like 2 + 2 = 4 must be true simply as a consequence of the meaning of its terms by saying that this claim cannot be right because analytic truths cannot have existential implications. Field rightly contends that we cannot infer the existence of things from merely definitional truths, an insight gained from discussions of the ontological argument. But it is only his unquestioned presupposition of the proffered criterion of ontological commitment that leads Field to think that a statement like 2 + 2 = 4 has existential implications. Deny that criterion, and one is not forced into the awkward position of denying that 2 + 2 = 4. In short, one's attitude toward the objection from the obviousness of elementary arithmetic is probably going to depend on one's attitude toward the proffered criterion of ontological commitment. If with the fictionalist, we are convinced that quantification and singular terms are devices of ontological commitment, then we shall find upon reflection that the sentences of elementary mathematics, if taken literally, are anything but obvious. For we shall come to see that statements which we have unhesitatingly accepted as true since childhood are in fact radical ontological assertions about the existence of mind-independent abstract objects. As such, they are not at all obviously true. We come to realize that we have in fact misunderstood them all these years. We literally did not understand what we were asserting. On the other hand, if we find sentences of elementary arithmetic to be obvious because we do not take them to be ontologically committing, then we shall be led to reject the proffered criterion of ontological commitment, which would saddle us with such commitments. This seems to me the obvious course to take. Indeed, the anti-Platonist has a quick and easy argument to that end. 1. If the proffered criterion of ontological commitment is correct, then 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. 2. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 3. Therefore, the proffered criterion of ontological commitment is not correct. After all, the sentences of elementary mathematics are much more obviously true than any criterion of ontological commitment, and so should be more tenaciously held and less quickly surrendered than the proffered criterion of ontological commitment. Any comment on fictionalism? Quincy.
So ever since the foundation of logic, people have always appealed to mathematics as a foundation of logic. For example, Descartes himself appeals to certain necessary truths like the 3 angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees, therefore it's necessary, and mathematics and logic go hand in hand. So how could one hold on to fictionalism without undercutting or providing a defeater for all of logical rationality?
What Field and other fictionalists maintain is that mathematics doesn't need to be true in order to be useful. They maintain that the use of mathematics in scientific theories is not meant to tell us something about the abstract realm of these mathematical objects, but it is meant to give us what's called the nominalistic content of science, to tell us about the way the physical world is. And you can use these useful fictions in order to get to the nominalistic truth of science. And so the fundamental claim of people like Field is that mathematics doesn't need to be true in order to be good.
Got a question online from Leonard. Could you replace the 2 plus 2 equals 4 in the argument against...
Could I do what?
Could you replace the 2 plus 2 equals 4 in the argument against the proffered criterion of ontological commitment with something like 1 is greater than 0? Does any mathematical statement work?
Oh, sure. If the proffered criterion of ontological commitment is correct, then 1 is not greater than 0. But 1 is greater than 0, therefore the criterion is not correct. Okay, well, fictionalism is a widespread point of view today, although not one that I personally adopt. 3.42132, ultima facie strategies. Ultima facie interpretive strategies are a diverse group of anti-realist responses to indispensability arguments, united by the conviction that true mathematical sentences are capable of being reformulated or interpreted without prejudice to their truth in such a way as to avoid any ontological commitments to abstract objects. Proponents of the indispensability argument themselves do not take us to be committed ontologically to all the things referred to or quantified over in ordinary language. For example, if I say, there are deep differences between Republicans and Democrats, I do not mean to commit myself to the existence of objects called differences, some of which are deep, despite my use of the informal quantifier there is. In a case like this, I can reformulate my original claim so as to serve the same purpose without such ontological commitments on my part. For example, Republicans differ deeply from Democrats. Proponents of the indispensability argument demand such paraphrases of mathematical sentences from anti-realists, confident that they cannot be provided. In fact, however, there are a number of strategies for reformulating or interpreting mathematical sentences which preserve their truth without ontological commitment to mathematical objects. The strategies of Jeffrey Hellman's modal structuralism, Charles Chihara's constructibilism, and Stephen Yablow's figuralism come to mind. It is noteworthy that the mathematical adequacies of the paraphrases of mathematical sentences offered by ultima facie strategists has gone largely unchallenged. All right, 3.42133, pretense theory. Pretense theory takes no position with respect to the truth value of discourse involving quantification over or reference to abstract objects. The pretense theorist's essential point, rather, is that whether or not such sentences are true, we are invited to imagine that they are true. Abstract discourse is fictional and therefore does not commit us to the reality of abstract objects. Contemporary theories of fiction draw much of their inspiration from the brilliant pioneering work of Kendall Walton. Prescribed imagining lies at the heart of Walton's theory of fiction. Fictional propositions are propositions which, in certain contexts, we are to imagine to be true. Walton emphasizes that truth and fictionality are not mutually exclusive. Some of the propositions prescribed to be imagined by a historical fiction like War and Peace, for example, may be true. Even if all the sentences in a novel about the future, like George Orwell's 1984, turned out to be true, that novel still remains fiction. What is essential to fictionality is not falsehood, but a prescription to be imagined. Mary Leng is an anti-realist philosopher of mathematics who embraces Walton's theory of fiction in order to deal with the alleged commitments of our best scientific theories to mathematical objects. Leng regards the mathematical objects appearing in our scientific theories as merely useful fictions. In support of the plausibility of her view, Leng provides two non-mathematical examples of the use of fictions in scientific theorizing: idealizations, like ideal gases, and theoretical entities like certain fundamental particles. These two cases illustrate the point that even in our best scientific theories, a reason to speak as if an object existed is not always a reason to believe that that object exists. Leng thinks that nothing in our current best scientific worldview gives us good reason to believe in mathematical objects as anything more than useful fictions. Hence, we have no reason to think that such objects exist. An important objection to pretense theory is that mathematics is not of the genre of fiction. Mathematicians and scientists take mathematics to be a body of knowledge and a realm of discovery, not invention. To regard mathematical statements as fictional is alleged to distort the nature of this discipline. In weighing this objection, we need to keep in mind that the pretense theorist is not defending a hermeneutical claim about how professional mathematicians or scientists in fact understand mathematical sentences. In order to undercut the indispensability argument for Platonism, the pretense theorist need show only that mathematical sentences can be reasonably taken to be fictional. In fact, there are some features of mathematical discourse that make it seem a prime candidate for a fictional interpretation. For example, axiomatization of mathematical theories naturally invites a pretense theoretical interpretation. Take the axiom of infinity in standard Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory. Here is the axiom of infinity. There exists a set X having the empty set as a member, and for any member Y of X, the union of Y and the set of Y is also a member of X. It is striking that this is the only axiom of standard set theory with existential implications. On a pretense theoretical approach, the axiom of infinity is something we are prescribed to imagine true. We are to make believe that there is an infinity of these things called sets, and then are free to explore the fictional world of our imagination. This will certainly be a journey of discovery, which will issue in a great deal of knowledge of the mathematical world determined by the axioms. Such an attitude toward the axioms of set theory is not uncommon among mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics. For example, postulationalism, which treats the axioms of competing set theories as postulates whose consequences may be explored, invites us, in effect, to make believe that the axioms are true without committing ourselves to their objective truth. In fact, the philosopher of mathematics, Stuart Shapiro, observes, and I quote, "The strongest versions of working realism are no more than claims that mathematics can or should be practiced as if the subject matter were a realm of independently existing, abstract, eternal entities," end quote. This characterization would make working realists into pretense theorists. But is it plausible to take the axiom of infinity as something prescribed to be imagined, rather than as a straightforward metaphysical assertion? I think the answer is obviously affirmative. It is universally admitted that the axiom of infinity is not intuitively obvious. Its lack of intuitive warrant was one of the heavy stones that helped to sink logicism, an early 20th century attempt to derive set theory from logic alone. Since the axiom lacks intuitive warrant, the axiom of infinity is adopted by contemporary mathematicians for reasons that are variously called pragmatic, or regressive, or extrinsic, reasons which do not justify its truth, but its mathematical utility. Moreover, as Michael Potter points out, there are multiple versions of the axiom of infinity which postulate different sets. A defense of the axiom on pragmatic grounds, he says, does not give us directly a ground for preferring one sort of axiom of infinity over another, since any of them will work. As a result, says Potter, Platonists have frustratingly little they can say by way of a justification for their preferred version of the axiom. As a serious assertion of ontology, the axiom of infinity is a breathtaking assertion that utterly outstrips our intuitions. Now, so much more can be said on this head, but axiomatic set theory seems to be a perfect candidate for a pretense theoretical approach. This conclusion has sweeping significance because set theory is typically regarded as foundational for the rest of mathematics, since the whole of mathematics can be reductively analyzed in terms of pure sets. In the words of philosopher of mathematics Penelope Matty, our much valued mathematical knowledge rests on two supports: inexorable deductive logic, the stuff of proof, and the set theoretic axioms. If the latter involve no ontological commitments, neither does the whole of mathematics. Any question or discussion of pretense theory? Okay, over here. And your name?
Carlos.
Carlos. Okay.
I've been listening for a long time your conference, and you always mention abstract objects like this in this case. And this is also what you're saying. But I wonder if there are some people who doesn't believe the abstract objects are not only for the material or physical world. So I don't know if
I'm not sure I understood your question, Carlos. The best challenge to divine aseity comes from these abstract objects, because physical objects don't exist necessarily in ase. And therefore, I don't think there's any challenge in the physical, concrete world to divine aseity. The challenge comes from this mathematical realm of abstract objects. And so that's what we have to ask if we're ontologically committed to. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
We've got a question online from Robert Forrest. Pretense theory sounds close to fictionalism, especially since the word fiction is used many times in the explanation of pretense theory. How do they differ? Is it just flat denial versus non-commitment to truthfulness?
Yes, that is part of it. The fictionalist says that mathematical statements are false or untrue. The pretense theorist makes no such assertion. The distinctive claim of the pretense theorist is that these statements are to be imagined true, that mathematics is make-believe. You make believe that these things are true. And that's not characteristic of fictionalism. In a way, the name fictionalism is a very unfortunate name because it does tend to confuse it with pretense theory, which is based in large part on Walton's theory of fiction, dealing with fictional objects like Hamlet and Sherlock Holmes and other statements that are true in fiction, but not true independent of fiction. So despite the names, don't confuse fictionalism, which is simply the claim that mathematical statements are false because they accept the criterion of ontological commitment of the Platonists. See, the Platonist and the fictionalist are on the same footing. They both accept the same criterion of ontological commitment, and the Platonist says, therefore, these statements are true and the objects exist. The fictionalist says these statements are false, and so the objects don't exist. And the pretense theorist is just quite different. The pretense theorist says that what we're talking about here is make-believe. We're talking about statements that are prescribed to be imagined as true.